Welcome to everyone to the webinar on COVID-19 and IMF World Bank. I'm Maju Varghese from Center for Financial Accountability. This webinar is being organized as part of the Action Week, which is a campaign which is happening from 12th to 16th of this month, where a number of civil society organizations have come together imagining a world without World Bank. The actions include, apart from webinars, tweeting, blogging, publishing on reforms which are being pushed by the World Bank and the Bretton Woods institutions. These actions are being held in parallel to the World Bank annual meeting currently happening virtually. As Medha Patkar, the leader of the Narmada Bachao Andolan and the National Alliance of People's Movement, in her video supporting the campaign says, while the intellectuals and policymakers are finding it difficult to imagine a world without World Bank, it is the people and people's politics which could ensure a true sovereignty of people and a true Atmanirbharta. The pandemic, as we all know, has created not just a health crisis, which continues, but all other kinds of crises, including an economic crisis, a debt crisis, a crisis in terms of inequality, an educational crisis, and so on. It will therefore be interesting to look into the role of the World Bank and the institutions, which was partly created after the Great Depression in the 30s to prevent another economic catastrophe. It is well known that these institutions have been pushing an agenda of liberalization, privatization, and globalization, of particularly with that of emerging and developing countries. Today we will discuss about the various policies pursued by IMF and the World Bank, and we have an eminent panel to discuss the same. Today's webinar will be moderated by Vidya Dinker. Vidya Dinker is the president of the Indian Social Action Forum, INSAF, and she's an activist from Mangalore, South India, who have been following and researching on projects by Asian Development Bank, Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank, and other multilateral and bilateral investments in the country. She has been an active voice in demanding accountability of financial institutions to communities who are affected by these projects. Vidya ji also coordinates Growth Watch, an action research initiative monitoring corporate profiteering, and have been fighting with farmers against corporate takeover of land, fighting SEZs and land acquisition. She has a strong connect with communities and has been fighting not just economic dispossession, but also in building social harmony and fighting the community divide. Before handing over to Vidya Tai, there are certain ground rules which I would like to spell out. One is to keep your audio muted at all times. Please type in your questions in the chat box, which will be taken after the presentations. So please allow all the presentations to finish first. Moderator will club the questions or take the questions in the order she feels fit. Over to you, Vidya Tai.
Thank you, Maju. Thank you. And of course, thank you and welcome all to this session that we are calling COVID-19 and IMF World Bank. Did the reform agenda get a booster? And, you know, as Maju said, they've been all around interfering and engaging with our governments and our lives. And let me sort of zoom out I mean, we all know of the concept of a humanitarian pause in war times, right? To provide for the safe evacuation of the wounded, to facilitate the movement of humanitarian aid convoys, even a ceasefire for celebrating an important festival or even a new year, and for international monitors to ensure adherence to international humanitarian law, or simply as a confidence building measure, a temporary respite, a reprieve from pain. And therefore, I think today's deep dive into what these Bretton Woods institutions have been doing and whether they've actually thought about the world differently because of the COVID-19 outbreak is an important pause for us to take and to reevaluate their necessity and relevance in the COVID situation and the post-COVID situation. We know that people's movements and our communities have been resisting them, but of course our bureaucrats and our leaders are quite enthusiastic about what they think they contribute to our countries. But we think we can put the blame of many of the multiple crises that our people are in the midst of right there at the bank's doorstep. We know of people's resistance across countries against the World Bank, and we will say that the crisis in rights, the climate crisis, the agrarian crisis, the food and farming crisis, the economic, the health, the ecological, the worker crisis, the livelihood crisis, the debt crisis, really is all manipulated, has been brought about, one, by these banks, and then they go ahead and use and manipulate the debt crisis that we are all in at this time. And therefore, I think we'll first begin with one important booklet that is, of course, online, brought about by CFA. It's called Pandemic as an Opportunity: COVID-19 Outbreak and Response of Multilateral Development Banks. It has been written, and Maju, yes, would you pull it up? So would you be able to share screen so we see the cover of this book? Yes, there it is. The virus has been playing havoc in so many different ways. This has a foreword, of course, by Medha Patkar, also because we all know the kind of valiant fight that she and her group in the Narmada have been fighting, and how they have made the World Bank review, their whole process of engagement in the Narmada projects. Remember, these institutions will review, but they will hardly ever redress or do any kind of reparation. And that is why I think to keep the focus on these institutions, old as they may be, they need to have our pressure on. And thank you, the authors of this book from CFA. Anuradha Munshi is a key author of this book. And can I call upon Anuradha, please, to give us an insight as to why you thought bringing out this book was important at this time.
Thank you so much, Vidya. I'll just talk about, of course, what the book captures and why it was important. This report basically talks about the opportunism of multilateral development banks, and especially in the face of the COVID pandemic. It looks into the funds to understand the push for privatization, commodification, policy changes in social security, banking, health systems. It also looks at the role of World Bank beyond fund provider as an anchor of global funds, as a manager, and as an entity that actually looks into the interest of the corporate world. Hopefully you will all find reading this interesting and useful. It's extremely important because it seems that from our review of these funds, it seems that in these institutions have found a new life, a new relevance, and the manner in which they have brought in their old agenda and packaged it in a new way. I think more than ever, with the kind of doublespeak even our governments are doing, it is important to understand these institutions, their modus operandi, and call out to them and see for deliberate on the ways we need to engage, we need to challenge these institutions and their ideas. Thank you.
Absolutely. It is so important. And therefore this, as I said, deep dive into what these development banks, these multilateral development banks are doing in our spaces, spaces that we are always trying to retain and, we're always trying to push back the corporate profiteering that they are bringing in so blatantly into our communities and where we live. We are trying to talk again and again of a world without the World Bank. And I think when the World Bank sort of convenes, even if it's a virtual annual general meeting, it is important to call them out, as we've been doing every day, but also at this point of time, it's important to call them out, it's important to protest, and therefore, this is part of the World Without World Bank Action Week that the working group on IFIs has called about. For bringing us in, we have the larger picture brought to us by Nezir Sinani, who is co-director of Recourse, who will speak on COVID-19 support by the World Bank and IMF and its policy implications and the challenges for nations across the world. Next, we have a zoom in on South Asia, where Hasan Mehedi of CLEAN, Coastal Livelihood and Environmental Action Network in Bangladesh, will talk about COVID-19 support by, of course, the World Bank and IMF and its implications in his country, especially in the context of Bangladesh's rising debt crisis and indeed South Asia's. And will point out, I'm very sure, the long-term policy impacts. To follow that up, we will come back to Anuradha Munshi of CFA, who will give us details of the COVID-19 assistance by the World Bank in the context of India. Each of our speakers will take about 15 minutes each, after which we will have a question and answer, and you're encouraged, of course, as Madhu said, to type in your questions in the chat. Let me introduce our first speaker, who's raring to go. Nezir Sinani is co-director at Recourse in the Netherlands and is a seasoned international development specialist with experience in environmental and social policy research, strategic communications, and civil society advocacy. As former manager for the climate program at the Bank Information Center in Washington, DC, and research analyst for the Institute for Development Policy in Kosovo, he has real in-depth understanding of the engagement of civil society to advocate for sustainable development standards and safeguards. Remember, we never have too much confidence on these multilateral development banks keeping to their own safeguards, their own policies, forget about our laws or our constitutional mandate. Nezir has also served as corporate communications manager for a state-owned energy company in Kosovo, where he led public outreach and media engagement during a process of structural reform in the energy sector, and as a communication specialist for a government's reforms process funded by USAID in Kosovo, focused on civil society engagement, civic education, and awareness campaigns. Nezir, the mic is yours.
Thank you so much, Vidya. Yeah. I don't know. Did someone want to say something?
Madhu, if
you have
you were
to
trying to
unmute.
say something, you have to unmute, yes.
Before Nasir begins, there is interpretation available, and to hear Nasir in Hindi or any of the speakers in Hindi, kindly go and select the Hindi
Interpretation.
tab. Yeah, the
yes,
interpretation
the
is
globe.
available.
So the globe.
Details are there in the chat box.
Yes. So do open up your chats, those who want, जिनको हिंदी की अनुवाद चाहिए, जो नज़ीर हिंदी नहीं बोल सकते, so he will speak in English. वो कोसोवन में भी नहीं बोलेंगे तो हम लोग हिंदी अनुवाद कर पाएंगे. So please hit the globe and you will get your interpretation in Hindi. Go ahead, Nezir.
Yeah, thank you so much, Vidya, and thank you, Madhu, as well for that. It's important that we understand each other to start with. So it's a real pleasure to join you really today. So thanks so much for inviting me and to have this discussion. I do have a presentation as well, so I'm going to try and share my screen with you guys. I hope it works. And well, let's see. Well, let me know if it doesn't, and then
Yes, it is working now, but make it full screen, the presentation.
there we go.
Yep.
Perfect. So, as we just said, I'm Nezir Sinani. I'm co-director at Recourse, which is a small not-for-profit, non-governmental organization that's based in the Netherlands. And we're primarily a watchdog group for the international finance institutions. So we do a lot of monitoring of the work of the World Bank group. As of recently, we've been doing a lot of work around the IMF as well. And Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank is another bank that we work quite closely on too. And then together with many of our partners that you probably know as well, we do monitor the work of the other institutions as well, mainly in solidarity, but also because multilateral development banks are working together. There's a lot of times when we need to also join forces on the civil society side to basically work together to monitor the work of the institutions as well. So what I'm going to try and do today, in these 15 minutes, and I hope I can manage to do that just in time, is to talk a little bit about the involvement of the IMF and the World Bank, as part of the COVID-19 response, and have a slight focus on, their the opportunities that are there to build back better, basically, and how these institutions are dealing with much needed green recovery. Now, as we know, this is all, the pandemic is, a recent event, and there's a lot of information that still needs a lot of analyzing in terms of what the IMF and the World Bank are doing. And a lot of that information is coming to light in these last few weeks and even days. So what I'll be talking through is, the information that we worked on ourselves together with our partners on the engagement of the IMF and the World Bank as well on their COVID-19 response, and how far basically they're going in this topic of building back better, as I said. And I'll be starting with the IMF, just some overall overview in this slide that you can see here as well. So they're making it available $250 billion US, which is a quarter of their total lending capacity of 1 trillion. There's a link there which I'm happy to share in the chat box as well after the presentation for those who have an interest to dive deeper into the IMF response there, and they can track basically the IMF lending in that link directly as well. And as you can see also in this slide, the first wave of the finance of the IMF is done through these two different instruments that they call rapid financing instrument and rapid credit facility. As you can imagine, this finance can be used for a wide range of COVID-related activities, which are not limited just to health and social spending. And one last thing to mention, which is important, is that the IMF finance is provided to governments as budget support, which is what the presentation will really focus on. So this isn't direct project finance, but it's budget support to the governments who then in turn use the money that goes from the IMF as part of the COVID response itself. And just last night, Oxfam issued some information as to how the IMF lending is really working. I did not manage to read all of the information that they released, to be honest, this morning, but I did skim through some of it, and I thought it's important to bring for this discussion this slide here, just to give some perspective on how everything is going with regards to the IMF's response. So as you can see from this picture, it's quite alarming actually how the IMF is handling the COVID response. 84% of IMF's COVID-19 loans encourage, and in some cases even require, that countries adopt more tough austerity measures, which is, as I said, quite alarming. Then 76 out of the 91 IMF loans negotiated with 81 countries since March 2020 push for belt tightening that could result in cuts to public healthcare systems, pension schemes, wage freezes, and cuts for public sector workers. 9 countries are likely to introduce or increase the collection of VAT, which apply to everyday products like food, clothing, and household supplies, and fall disproportionately on lowest income households. And then 14 countries are likely to freeze or cut public sector wages and jobs. As I said, we're still trying to understand, how both IMF and the World Bank are really handling this response and what's coming out of them. We do know that the amounts that they're, sending out are huge, and now we're getting to see, the rubber is hitting the road, as I said. So we keep understanding more and more on what sort of strings attached are going with this response from these institutions and how those can help or, in this case, hamper developmental issues across the globe. And as you can see from this Oxfam report, the picture is pretty grim and pretty alarming, if you ask me. And IMF is going in the wrong direction, where it's quite safe to say in terms of the COVID response. And I took this language just to dive now into some of the issues that I want to talk with regards to green recovery and dive a little bit deeper. So I took a little bit of language from IMF documents and policies itself. You see they say COVID crisis won't change the climate, but the response will, which we fully agree on. And then they also say unless the right energy prices are put in place, the extra investment induced by COVID recovery stimulus will be misallocated between clean and dirty sectors, resulting in one crisis leading to another. And this is really key to emphasize here. And the other crisis we're discussing here is the climate change. So what we really want to see these institutions do, besides getting their response right and helping countries in a meaningful way, we also want them to pay close attention to the climate change and to ensure that the response that they provide to these governments doesn't result in another crisis down the road or in exacerbating already a crisis that we're in. So what we did together with Center for Financial Accountability, Greenpeace and Earthlife Africa in South Africa, we reviewed IMF's latest policy reform agendas contained in Article 4 consultation reports for 5 countries, which does include India as well. And the reason why this is important is, as I said from the first slide, if you remember, it's because IMF's response to COVID-19 crisis is done through budget support to the governments, and any reform agendas that the governments are undertaking basically are identified in the Article 4 consultations of the IMF. So what we wanted to do is basically provide insights. By looking into the Article 4, we wanted to provide some important insights into the IMF's current priorities on macroeconomic risks and the recommended policy reforms shaping national budgets, tax policy, investment incentives, financial sector regulations, and prioritized infrastructure. And the overall aim basically of our analysis was to help provide a better response to both the COVID crisis and the climate crisis by identifying recommendations for IMF policy measures relevant to the energy sector. So is the IMF walking the talk? Basically, they're quite loud, and you probably have seen many public announcements by Kristalina Georgieva, who's the head of the IMF, but also other IMF staff. They talk big when it comes to climate and the green recovery and all this. As part of the COVID-19 recovery discussions as well. So we wanted to see, if, that holds true, or, it's just basically a statement that they used to give out there whenever they talk about climate. And despite, what we found is in our analysis is that despite their stated support basically for green stimulus and getting the energy price right, our review of the Article 4 reports in the 5 countries I mentioned shows that the IMF contradicts its own advice. Overall, the reports that we analyzed fail to recognize the scale of climate change-related macroeconomic risks, especially related to the energy transition, and thus policy advice continues to embed or ignore government subsidies and other investment incentives for fossil fuels, including coal. So on top of Oxfam's findings that we just mentioned, they're getting things wrong also on the energy side and the climate change side as well from, the brief analysis that we did in those 5 countries. And just briefly, these would be the 3 key findings basically from the report. And I'm going to be sharing the link to the report as well as I finish this presentation in our chat box. So anyone who wants to read further, they can do that. But the 3 key findings is, the first one, insufficient identification of climate change related macroeconomic risks. So out of the 5 countries we looked at, IMF identifies climate change as a macroeconomic risk only in Mozambique and Philippines. So India, Indonesia, and South Africa, climate change represents no risk whatsoever, according to the IMF. And even in Mozambique and Philippines, that's only done through the extreme weather events lens, so they don't go further from, identifying climate change as a risk in other respects at all. Fossil fuel producers' subsidies, including for coal, remain intact. So IMF is still supportive of tax incentives for new infrastructure investments, which often translate into tax breaks. Those would be subsidies for coal and other fossil fuels. And then the third one is IMF keeps encouraging governments around the world to basically increase public spending on prioritized infrastructure. But when you look into like India, Indonesia, and Mozambique, the government prioritized infrastructure includes coal power plants and or coal transport export infrastructure, as well as other mega fossil fuel projects. In this respect, IMF is either silent on these coal plants and or silent on the need for stranded asset stress tests for public investments altogether, which just shows that they don't pay much attention to what they're doing with their advice to the governments and with their requirements as well when it comes to policy reforms that they attach to the support that they give to these governments. So they don't just provide those requirements to the governments, but they have them all wrong, and they're still supporting coal and other fossil fuels in a big way in these countries. And then we have recommendations for them, which I'm not going to go into all of it, but we do want them to, for the full scale of climate change risks to be identified in these Article 4 assessments. It's a no-brainer, really, so to speak. And then all IMF funding agreements with governments should basically list coal, oil, and gas operations as excluded expenditures from our perspective. And then two others, so IMF should recognize the infrastructure investment incentives applied to fossil fuels, such as VAT exemptions that we mentioned briefly as well, represent producer subsidies and contradict carbon taxes and getting the energy price right. And this is really key, because also IMF is big in talking on the importance of the carbon tax. So they're contradicting themselves by keeping intact these fossil fuel subsidies, as I mentioned. And then the last one is the IMF should encourage and assist countries to reevaluate energy infrastructure investment plans to reflect stranded asset risks, current renewable energy costs, increasing global carbon taxes, and realistic power and fuel demand scenarios. So this is key, because as I said, the whole discussion should be about the opportunity to build back better. And the COVID pandemic does represent such an opportunity, and the IMF and the governments that they work with should sit together basically and come up with plans on how to do just that. So we have a few ideas in our report on how they can go about it in the energy sector, at least. And I think I'll stop there with the IMF. I'm happy to take questions when we get to the questions and answers. And just briefly, I'll talk through a little bit on the World Bank and COVID response as well. Also, the World Bank is planning to deliver a lot of money as part of their COVID response. So up to 160 billion in financing capacity through June 2021. Again, we have a link where you can follow all World Bank operations with regard to the COVID response. So I'm happy to share that link with you in the chat box following the presentation as well, where you can read more about the World Bank's response. The World Bank says that their support is tailored to health, economic, and social shocks that countries are facing, and includes over 50 billion of IDA resources on grant and high concessional terms. And IDA is their arm basically that works with third world countries, so to speak, in providing support to them. And then in addition to the stated health support goal, operations emphasize social protection, especially through cash transfers, poverty alleviation, and policy-based financing. And I emphasize the policy-based financing because, again, just like the IMF, also the World Bank provides most of its support to the governments as budget support or through this policy-based lending, which I'm going to be talking a little bit in my presentation as we go through. Again, took a quote from the Oxfam report that was released last night that looks a little bit into the World Bank's response to the COVID, and I thought it was important that we looked into it as well. So out of the 71 projects, as you can see from the slide, only 8 that are part of this World Bank's response to COVID. Only 8 of them basically make any move to eliminate or suspend fees that exclude people from life-saving healthcare, and this despite fees being prohibitive in at least 80% of those countries. And as you can see, the impact in poverty in many of these countries is huge when it comes to out-of-the-pocket healthcare expenses. So we would have imagined that the World Bank would pay a little bit more attention and would focus its efforts to basically make this right. But it looks like the bank again is not doing just that, what we expect of them, which is in no way a surprise considering how the bank really operates. So I thought that, again, the report is out there. I saw the Oxfam made it available last night, and I'm happy to share the link to that as well for people to read a little bit more. I just skimmed through and it looked quite an interesting paper to allow us to analyze what the World Bank is doing as part of this COVID response itself. But as I said, I would like to just say a few words on the bank's policy advice, because this is the instrument that the World Bank uses to work with governments basically to introduce specific reforms, and a lot of these reforms are going to be sought now to be achieved as part of the COVID-19 response as well. But they do use this instrument to influence government policies and institutions, and what this means is that they provide a specific amount of money to every government that they work with, but in order for them to receive the amount, then the governments have to introduce specific policy reforms to basically achieve specific developmental goals within that country that the World Bank and the government identify together. And a lot of these decisions do impact carbon-intensive development or low-carbon development as well. So what we did together with a few of our partners, again, it was Friend of the Earth in Mozambique, Greenpeace, and DAR in Peru. We analyzed, banks' policy operations involving infrastructure investments in 4 countries: Peru, Indonesia, Egypt, and Mozambique. And we did that through a climate lens, so to speak, to see if the World Bank in its policy lending business is asking governments to introduce reforms that benefit or harm climate approach of those countries, and if the fossil fuel industry, again in this case, was benefiting or not. So basically the banks here, I put just the overall sort of like the finding that the bank's policy lending did support incentives aimed at increasing renewable energy investments. Overall, the World Bank's DPF operations did not get the incentives right for a low carbon transition in the 4 countries that we looked at. And these were the main findings. So the policy reforms that the bank asked those governments to introduce, basically introduce new fossil fuel subsidies, including for coal, lacked policy support and incentives for renewable energy, undermined environmental governance, exacerbating climate change risks of large-scale infrastructure, heightened deforestation risks, and lacked adequate climate change risk assessments. Now, how this works is, I just copied this table here, basically, is what you see in it is basically the type of policy reforms that were introduced in those 4 countries and that were part of sort of like requirements or conditionalities, really, that the World Bank put in place as part of the loans that they provided to the 4 countries. So in the second column, next to the country column, you can see the different type of policy reforms that were introduced as part of these loans in those countries. So you see a lot of PPP laws and so on and so forth. But what we did then, we went a step further and then analyzed the industry in all those 4 countries that were slated to benefit basically out of the policy reforms that the 4 countries were introducing. So that's in the last column, in the third one. So as you can see there, out of the reforms that were introduced, fossil fuel industry across the board in all 4 countries was the #1 industry that was, aligned to benefit out of the new reforms. And that was pretty alarming and disheartening as well, because what's happening now at the World Bank, the development policies or policy lending is becoming more and more important, and they're dispersing more money through this policy arm, because it's more money out of the door in an easier way for them, because there's very few safeguards that apply to basically this type of lending within the World Bank, and the bank can basically get away with pretty much anything that they want, by this type of lending in this country, despite this, alarming findings from our report itself. And a lot of the funding that's going to go now as part of the longer term COVID response to these countries is going to be dispersed through policy loans as well. So it's really key to pay close attention to what kind of reforms will be attached or required by the World Bank for the countries that receive this type of lending, so that we ensure that polluting bad industries around the world don't benefit out of it, but the money goes to the needed sectors to basically overcome the crisis itself and build back better, as I said. Again, for this, we did have specific recommendations for the bank on how to handle the problems that we came across. So I'm not going to read through them. You can probably all see them, because I know I'm out of my time now. But what's important to mention here is that the World Bank has engaged with us as civil society in discussing the opportunities to close the loopholes that we've identified, and to try and do something about closing those loopholes. And what's happening currently is the bank is about to embark on a process to revise its policy lending instrument, or go back and review retroactively on how its implementation has worked or not so far. And it's going to be an open process that's going to allow for civil society to engage as well in the months to come. So hopefully we'll be able to engage with them and fix, to the extent possible, the problems that we've come across in this type of lending by the World Bank. So we'll see how that process overall goes. So I'm going to stop there. I don't think I would be able to really wrap up, in any way by saying that the IMF and the World Bank are doing the right thing as part of this COVID response. So far, from the initial findings, both in our report, but also the Oxfam reports, it looks like they have both gotten everything wrong. So I don't know if it would be really, if it's a good thing for them to be in this game of the COVID response, and if they're helping countries achieve, recovery and the recovery that we need by building back better as well, or if the world would be a better place without them. So I think from seeing this, it's pretty clear that they seem to be doing more harm than good, but we'll see how things go for the next month, and hopefully they'll learn some lessons and do better as they move forward. But I'll stop here, and then we can hopefully discuss a little bit more.
Thank you, Nezir.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for showing us so very clearly that, although the World Bank had sounded the alarm that we're hurtling towards an average temperature rise of 4 degrees, what they're doing in terms of COVID recovery policy push or packages, stimulus packages that they are pushing out to countries, it's clearly going in the other direction, where they're going to just exacerbate the climate crisis. So thank you for saying that very clearly, and very clearly articulating our collective recommendations, I think, about no subsidies for fossil fuel or the coal industry, etc. The World Bank and the IMF are pretty clear that, most low-income countries are in debt distress, and a very high risk debt distress. There's also the possibility of saying, but are they planning to do so? Oh no. Is there debt cancellation? As I said, a humanitarian pause in a crisis? No. What they are doing is coming in with more money and perhaps just increasing the debt of countries. There is South Asia, of course, and especially Bangladesh, that has been, really caught in this debt trap. There's someone who has been constantly drawing our attention to this. Hasan Mehedi has been a human rights and environmental activist ever since 1998 and is the chief executive of CLEAN, which is Coastal Livelihood and Environmental Action Network, Bangladesh. So I'm sure he has plenty to say about the climate change risks. I'm also horrified that, these institutions are saying India doesn't have any climate change risk. And I mean, I would call it a climate crisis risk. I also live on the coast, but I think Hasan, who lives in Khulna in Bangladesh, is more suited to bring up those issues. He is also a member secretary of the Bangladesh Working Group on External Debt, BWGED, which is a forum that he helped set up of 43 local and national organizations who are monitoring destructive projects financed by multilateral, multinational, and bilateral financial institutions. He is also the South Asia member of the International Committee of the NGO Forum on ADB. A committed campaigner. Mehedi focuses on the sectors of energy, climate change, I would say climate crisis, forest and agriculture. Mehedi.
Thank you, Vidya. It's a long introduction for me.
And not as long as what you do there.
Okay, I'm sharing one of my presentations. Is it okay?
Yeah, we have it.
Yeah.
Full screen, please, Mehedi.
Yeah, you can see it. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Nezir, for focusing all of the issues that that I wanted to also tell about something, but it's not necessary now because you covered many things which is very common in South Asia also. So I can go straight to some of the data very quickly. It's non-formal sector contributes 93% of Bangladesh economy. That's the first thing. Second thing is agriculture. That means small scale agriculture, who are the marginal or small farmers. They are around 18 million people, which is 47% of total domestic labor force. And garment sector is contributing 21% of total domestic labor force, where expatriate laborers who are from Middle East mainly and Malaysia, they contribute around 9 million of the labor force in Bangladesh. So that's the people where we should focus in our whole thing. But where the investments are going, that's my actually point to talk. So directly, income from garment sector reduced from 29 million a month to 3 million a month. Now it again has gone a little bit more, increased, which is 6.3 million a month now. Remittance reduced from 30 million a month to around 4.5 million a month. Now it's reached again 3.5 million. Okay, so it's went down again. Laborers from Middle Eastern countries started coming back after pandemic. 700,000 of laborers have come back from Middle East in last 3.5 months. That means earlier, and now 1/3 will not be able to go back again forever, according to their association. Domestic market is facing serious problems, especially the Bengali New Year, the Eid festival, and this type of festivals. They couldn't sell even 10% of their products. Government has been trying to balance between safety measures and economic activities. This indecision hampered from the both sides. The national budget has been shrink, and estimated growth of this year is around 3 to 5%, although World Bank says it's 2.7%, but the government didn't agree, which was 8.3% in last fiscal year. That is the in very short. So in last 6 months, 16 days, number of total affected people are 389,000, and total death is 5,371. According to the independent sources, that the numbers are at least twice of the official declaration, because government is not interested to test a large number of people. So here you can see the number of people, but hospital beds, it's only better than Nepal, who has 0.30 hospital beds per 1,000 people, where Bangladesh has 0.70 hospital beds, ICU beds. So very now, around 18 million farmers has lost their capacity to further invest in agriculture, as most of them are either small producers, sharecroppers, newly added 1 million skilled labor from Middle East and Malaysia looking for job, large international buyers from the garments products from Australia, USA, Germany, and Italy are creating pressure on the local producer to stop supply or reduce price. Collected samples for test are almost thrice of the capacity now, and number of confirmed cases are increasing every day as they are not tested and quarantined at initial stage. So debt scenario, here is the debt of Bangladesh since the independence 47 years ago. So it was 25.631 million. Now it is $6.4 million. It's reached. So external debt received 58 billion. Debt repaid 25 billion around, and now outstanding debt is $38 billion. So what it takes, debt repayment per year is now 10.9% of the total budget, national budget, whereas budget allocation for agriculture is 2.69%, health in 4.9%, and food supply 0.9%, and power sector is getting 5.4%. So loan repayment is one of the highest sector which is getting 10.9% of debt repayment this year. So the government has to pay $6.87 billion as per installment as installments of domestic and external loan this year. Among the amount 3.7 billion to the bilateral multilateral financiers. The government has to pay around $1.2 billion to the private sector power companies only as the capacity charge for their idle power plants. As the government is facing overcapacity in power sector, it is overcapacity is now 48.9%, and without producing a single unit of electricity, it has to pay $1.2 billion to them. Exports have declined sharply, and further reductions are estimated. Remittances growth, contraction of domestic consumption, micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises face severe challenges, and pandemic has a serious impact on poverty also. So new loan. So it's like our houses are burning, and these bilateral or multilateral financial institutes, they are roasting their potatoes in the fire of our houses. The government needs around $8.8 billion to face the negative impacts of COVID-19. This much amount is required to develop health system, ensure food security, and ensure employment of newly unemployed laborers. In this situation, Asian Development Bank, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, World Bank, and International Monetary Fund should have cancelled their loan repayments, but they have come up with new loans where ADB is financing, AIB, World Bank, and IMF. They put a total $2.3 billion on the shoulder of poor people of Bangladesh. World Bank and IMF called developing countries to cancel the repayment, but they haven't do it. It's that much hypocrisy it is. So here is the loan structure. ADB has given $950 million till now. AIB 250 million, IMF 732 million, and World Bank 203 million. So the conditions are bailout of the private sector, including garments, shutting down the state-owned enterprise, including jute sector, which is the largest sector, and after this loan, government has shut down 52 jute mills, which is around 59,000 laborers are there. So there are again 59,000 more people become jobless. Privatization of the health sector is the another condition in the loans. So what is the results? The results are more debt service in next 2021, and one thing I should mention that this COVID emergency response project is actually a 5-year long project, and it's called emergency loan, and emergency loan is for 5 years, and COVID is happening now. So the response is like that. Second thing is more corruption. Already several reports revealed in the newspapers that to buy some of the apparatus, some of the equipment, the ministry and the contractors, they estimated a price which is 100 times more than the market price. That's what happened. And in this 5-6 months, 3 of the project directors have quitted from their position, and 4 of the private clinic owners are in jail now. One of the driver, he's a driver of the project directors. The anti-corruption department found that he has 100 crore taka of worth 100 crore, which is 1 billion taka he has earned from his job as a driver. Reduced allocation for basic services to pay loan, and more disparity. You know, Bangladesh is one of the countries, is the top countries to grow disparity in last 5 years. Shutting down of jute sectors, which is the largest sector. I already told you about that. That is the result here. And this is some of the newspaper news. So that's all from my side. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Mehedi, so much. Because I think it's very important what you brought forth as to how, you know, the loan and the debt crisis is just, you know, sort of ballooning in your own country, as of course in many other countries, because of these banks. Also, you brought us face to face with how their policies are working out on the ground, how private players are being supported, how state-owned enterprises are being pushed in policy as a burden in our countries. And of course, better public services or better healthcare services are not coming our way. I will now move, because we're looking into our next half hour, and we do need time for Q&A, for questions or comments that you might all have. Let me introduce to you our final speaker for today, Anuradha Munshi, who is a research coordinator at the Center for Financial Accountability and has been working on issues on accountability and transparency of IFIs for some time now. Tell us, Anuradha, what the World Bank and the IMF have been up to in our country during the pandemic in the guise of COVID crisis response.
Thank you so much, Vidya. And thanks to Nezir and Mehedi bhai for putting out some of the concerns that I'm also going to reiterate. I will try and keep my presentation brief. I want to have some time for discussion also. So just to put this entire thing in context, let me just quote David Malpass, World Bank president, who addressed G20 finance ministers in March. And I quote him: "Countries will need to implement structural reforms to help shorten the time to recovery and create confidence that the recovery can be strong. For those countries that have excessive regulations, subsidies, licensing regimes, trade protection, or litigiousness as obstacles, we will work with them to foster markets choice, and faster growth prospects during recovery. This statement actually sets forth the context. Though the institutions like World Bank Group and IMF have provided fund support for COVID-19, these funds are attached with conditionalities. This opportunism is not new to the bank. In the past also, these institutions have indulged in disaster capitalism. Not very far back in 2013, when Uttarakhand received heavy rainfalls causing flash floods at various locations, a joint rapid damage and needs assessment report was prepared by World Bank, jointly by World Bank, ADB, and the Department of Economic Affairs India. This report became the basis of damage assessment, formulating a recovery framework. All the implementation of recovery programs was done along with these institutions. These institutions have become almost like these parastatal agencies, planning, changing our policies, and violating our constitutional right in terms of decision making with regards to our common resources, public resources. Similarly, in Kerala, the same pattern was followed after the floods of 2018 and 2019. Joint assessment was done by ADB, World Bank, and Government of India and Government of Kerala, resulting in development policy loans in 2018 and then in 2019 as well. And this is not new. This kind of pattern is also seen in other countries. In Indonesia, after the tsunami, loans worth 1.1 billion $1.1 billion were given, and the policy reforms supported through them basically were new laws on oil, gas, electricity that allowed for privatization in respective state enterprises. It is in this context of disaster capitalism. In fact, it is a continuation of their disaster capitalism policy that they have followed for so long, that the lending of COVID can also be seen. If we look at so far, if we look at World Bank, Asian Development Bank, Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, and New Development Bank, India has received close to $6.5 billion. And if you only look at the World Bank has given funds worth $2.75 billion to India through 3 projects mainly. More can be in pipeline. They are something we don't know about as of now, but there will definitely be more in pipeline. So right now, India has negotiated a development policy loan for accelerated India's COVID-19 social protection response program with the World Bank. As Nezir had also mentioned, development policy loans come with strings attached to them. Over here in this particular social protection response program, there are 8 prior actions and 8 triggers for this loan. Prior actions are policy and institutional actions demands deemed critical to achieving the objectives of the program, supported by the development policy operation. Now, these are mostly mostly policy changes that happen in this particular case in the social security sector. Many of the reforms which were announced in the financial package by Nirmala Sitharaman are directly from the reform book of international finance institutions, who have been demanding a rollback of labor, environmental regulation, power sector reforms, and relaxation of land acquisition laws. The World Bank has given close to $1 billion for emergency response and health systems preparedness project. So this project will immediately support for public health systems and also focus on integrating these systems with private entities like health insurance companies. So these are a part of government schemes. The third project they have funded in India is Micro, Small, Medium and Enterprises Emergency Response. It is a development policy financing to support Government of India in preserving flows of finance to MSME through COVID-19 crisis. The development policy operation will leverage private intermediaries in financial sector with the objective to privatize the public sector financial system. This seems to be in tune with the recent statement of the Union government that it is considering designating banking as a strategic sector under the new privatization policy announced under the Atmanirbhar Bharat package. The new privatization policy envisages that in each strategic sector, no more than 4 state-owned companies will exist. If we look at Asian Development Bank, it has given close to 1.5 billion US dollars in active response and expenditure support program, a project which will support government in mitigating health, social, economic impacts of COVID-19. The beneficiaries will be reached through established channels under the Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Yojana, and it is important over here to note that this scheme was first introduced as an income declaration scheme for those who wish to pay the penalty and declare unaccounted wealth, so they could avoid prosecution. Apart from this, ADB is financing technical assistance program. This is also co-financed with Republic of Korea and the Knowledge Partnership Fund, with the aim of strengthening universal health coverage and supporting implementation of Pradhan Mantri Jan Arogya Yojana. If you look at this technical assistance program, it aims to redefine India's healthcare system through digital solutions and financing, including experiences of health systems and reforms of countries such as Republic of Korea. You can actually see the design over here. Technical assistance programs have been long used by World Bank and ADB to bring in the role of policy makers, policy influencers, and changes in the country. ADB's role is no different. Their involvement in National Urban Health Mission and ADB's health sector engagement has been increasing over a period of time. Following the launch of Ayush Bharat in 2018, implementation of National Urban Health Mission under National Health Mission, ADB is now developing a support program for delivery of comprehensive healthcare in urban areas. So COVID funds are basically being used to push forward their already existing agenda in the country. So even though these funds are coming as emergency and fast track funds, they are not providing any new support. They are basically pushing forward the old agenda. And yes, this time, because the policy changes have been legitimized through emergency entry into the country. There is no conversation about not that there were earlier, but the fast track of it has provided even more less space for even civil society to engage on some of these issues, which could have probably happened earlier. The total lending is not huge for 3 trillion economy and whose annual budget is over 25 lakh crore. But the influence to change the economy and the mosaic of this country is huge, disproportionate for this lending. Now let's look at some of the very important issues that emerge out of it. One of the most important is the external debt. On one hand, our government is talking about Atmanirbhar Bharat, and on the other, India's external borrowing till June 2020, according to Reserve Bank of India, has reached 554.5 billion US dollars, which is more than what we borrowed in the entire year in 2019. The external debt to the GDP ratio has also increased to 21.8% at the end of June from 20.6% at the end of March 2020. It's also interesting how the government is bending all the Atmanirbhar Bharat policies they are drumbeating about to accommodate these loans. One of the recent developments has been change in preferential market access policies. The Health Systems Preparedness Project of the World Bank comes with the condition of universal eligibility in procurements, which effectively means public procurement. Preference to make in India order, micro, small, and medium enterprises policy. Certain benefits to startup shall not be applicable on purchases made while implementing of this particular project. And this could continue for any other project that could come in. Pushing for the interest of private players. This is not news to it, but sometimes the conflict of interest is so stark and it's difficult not to take notice of it. The World Bank is the convener of the Global Pandemic Supply Chain Network, which has identified a list of medical products critical to COVID-19 response. World Bank is working closely with WHO to support Government of India to plan and procure medical supplies and equipment to effectively respond to pandemic. Now, this network's role is to create and manage a market network, allowing for WHO and private sector partners to access any supply chain functionality and asset from end to end anywhere in the world at scale. The World Bank, as convener of this network, is in a position to influence decisions of governments, considering it's already financing health support emergency programs across the globe and not just in India. Another very alarming thing is the sudden, not exactly a sudden, I think a very strategic interest and area of World Bank is how it is using these programs during the COVID support programs to push for personal data, leverage technology, including artificial intelligence and big data analytics to supposedly improve the preparedness and response of Government of India. It's interesting to see how in absence of any proper laws and protection laws as to data collection and data commodification, how the World Bank is trying to capture this area, and every program that they are funding under COVID is coming with a mandatory clause of use of data, collection of new data, and so this is something we really need to watch out for. Again, World Bank is not only looking at the loans or money that they are providing, they are also taken this role of anchor of global funds, of multilateral funds. So the World Bank program for social protection includes parallel financing from AFD, the French development agency, and the German development agency, KfW. This is an addition to $1 billion parallel financing from ADB to the Government of India. The Japan International JICA, Japanese International Corporation Agency, and NDB are also exploring potential parallel financing. The development policy loan requires the offer of technical assistance to central and state governments. The World Bank is also in discussion with Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for additional funds for TA. The nation has described how the US $50 billion USD charitable enterprise of this foundation is more than just a charity and pushing for interests of private corporations. This is also mainly in sync with the World Bank's approach of maximizing finance for development under the headings such as billions to trillions, and now maximizing finance for development agenda. For achieving the sustainable development goals, blended finance and public-private partnerships are being used as main instruments to leveraging without offering evidence that either can or will deliver development projects much better than the traditional public procurement. Just to end with it, these funds are also being used to consolidate the hold of MDBs on policy making, fundamentally changing Indian polity and economy. Important policy decisions like universal health coverage, social protection policies, health policy, and use and collection of data are being decided in a fast track mode without public debate, or often even without public knowledge. This makes it especially important for civil society and movements to come together to question and challenge this. Whether this requires a parliamentary oversight is something we really need to deliberate about. Thank you.
Thank you, Anuradha. Thank you. And now we're actually going into the last 16 minutes. So it's a race to answer those questions. And I'd request all the speakers to, of course, answer the questions, but be very brief. We see that there is a kind of, we know how these institutions behave. Unfortunately, our governments are still, in this bankrupt mode. Without the World Bank and the IMF and the AIIB and the Japanese financiers and the ADB, they think their projects and their policies are completely non-functional. We know that it has cost us heavily in terms of public services, and we are demanding debt cancellation. We'll go to Raghunandan KC's question to Nezir. Nazir, he says it's a brief and very productive analysis, and he queries, is there nothing new about World Bank and IMF in the COVID context? It appears that it is business as usual, given the fact that they are consistently part of the WEF and their stakeholders through decades. So what is unique about the World Bank and IMF in COVID? In COVID times?
Yeah. I mean, I think the answer is really pretty straightforward. Like, if we look at the analysis we did and the analysis Oxfam has put forth, is it business as usual for these institutions? Sadly so, yeah. So we do see a great opportunity for them, to do things differently. As we say, they keep talking themselves about building back better all the time. They're so loud, like their PR is all about it and stuff. And they do hold a huge power globally in working, with governments and, also in terms of the money that they're dispersing. Like, combined, they're putting, $500 billion almost together out there. So it's a lot of money that they're putting out there. So a lot of good can happen and can be done with that money to start with. But then just on top of it, the power that they hold and, that they, exercise really in working with these governments is there, undeniably so. And that puts them in a specific position globally out there. So if they were to use that, in the right way, in a way to, help countries in a real sense overcome the crisis, but also, build back better in terms of the green recovery that I talk about, I think they could do a lot of good. But unfortunately, from where we stand and from, looking at what they're doing currently and how they're going about, using this money as part of the recovery, it's pretty alarming. I talked through the different findings of the Oxfam and our report, and it's disappointing, the least to say. So, as I said, it's still early stages. Hopefully they'll learn and they, they'll change the way they're doing this. But it's, it looks grim right now, and we need all the push there is out there to get these institutions where they have to be and they can be. So I'll just leave it there. So it's business as usual now, but hopefully it's going to change.
Thank you, Nazir. It is business as usual. And in fact, business is better for some of these banks right now, unfortunately, for all of us collectively. Debt cancellation, they will not think of. But we have, and I must draw your attention to the chat where Nazir has posted quite a few resources. He's put in the IMF COVID response tracker. He's put in World Bank COVID response track. He's put in a report by Recourse, CFA, Greenpeace, and EarthLife Africa on the IMF green recovery, and he's put forward Oxfam's analysis behind number spending, accountability, and recovery. And Maria Jose Romero from Eurodad also draws our attention and has posted a report which was published by them last week on IMF and austerity, Arrested Development it's called, and also the link to a letter that was signed by more than 500 organizations across the world and academics on the same issue. Okay, Himanshu Damle asks Nazir again, or shall we go to a question to Mehedi first? We'll come back to you, Nezir. Mehedi, excellent focused presentation with vital statistics, says Raghunandan KC, providing a clear picture of the impact of the World Bank, the ADB, and the IMF on the sovereignty of countries and impact of the people of Bangladesh. That was a comment. Sorry, not a question. But I think Maju had a question for you. Let me just bring it up. 1 second. Sorry, I'm looking. I saw Majoo's question, and now, of course, it does a disappearance. There are a lot of people who said, yes, question to Hasan. Mehedi, is debt suspension enough for developing countries? Could countries in the South collectively decide not to pay back World Bank funds? I think, Mehedi, you're the right person to answer that, because you've been pushing for debt cancellation from Bangladesh. You've got us all to sign on. So tell us what you think about that.
A very tricky question. It's one thing is when COVID first outbreak in Bangladesh, we started a petition to cancel the debt. That's one step. World Bank, IMF, and ADB especially is not only the institution to provide loan or grant. It's not a financial institution only. They are also claim themselves as a knowledge broker. They also make knowledge and push the countries for sustainable development according to their definition, which means more privatization, more acceptance, more accepting the Western companies to make business, more companies from the advanced developing countries to make business in the least developed countries or so-called developing countries like Bangladesh. So this is not only that debt cancellation; it's also get out from the position of prescribing the government to take new structural adjustment and so-called poverty reduction strategy paper, so-called sustainable development, so-called these all things. It should be people's-led. It should be taken and demanded by the people what to do in the country, not by you. You are not the citizen of Bangladesh or India or any South Asian countries. That's all. Thank you. Thank you, Madhuda.
Thank you, Mehedi. We are also looking at these two questions from Nezir, and next we'll go to Anuradha. Nezir, we have a question which is straight and simple. Well, you talked of the first wave of financing from the IMF, Himanshu says. So he presumes that there must be a second or a third wave. Are these similar to tranches, or is there a separate defining characteristic to these waves of financing? And does the IMF dictate what should the fiscal measure for a country, that is whether above the line or below the line fiscal measures? If it can dictate these terms, he'd like to still believe that the IMF has some resemblance of relevance, or else it is simply losing steam. That's what, Himanshu Damle wants to discuss with you. And Maju has a specific question. Why is World Bank dispersing rather slowly, despite its big pronouncements? Do you think that the World Bank funds could be pushing reforms post-pandemic? Yes, Nezir.
Yeah, so great both questions. I think on the IMF, they're really calling it the first wave, as sort of the emergency response that they're providing to the governments. And in terms of like the difference between what's to come, I think what they are saying now is that the amount of money that now they're giving out as part of the emergency response goes with no strings attached. So it has zero conditionalities basically to the government, and hopefully it's going to be used by them to support, the health institutions and the recovery efforts that need to be put in place as part of, dealing with the pandemic and the situation that we're in now. And then they're going to be moving to the next round of, supporting the governments, which is sort of more of the long-term recovery efforts that need to be put in place. And those most probably are going to be coming with the strings attached that we usually see from the IMF be put in place for this type of support. So we still have to wait and see when that's going to be happening. We're still in the middle of the pandemic, so I think there's still a lot of emergency support needed around the world, and I hope that support goes with no strings attached and goes to the health institutions where it's most needed. But we have to be mindful on how that's all working. And then when they move to this next stage, I think all the issues we talked about that we that we looked at also in the Article 4 reports remain valid. And I would even say that the emergency support that's going out of the IMF to these governments and the Article 4 recommendations that are in force right now do play a role already, because these Article 4 reports are updated every year. So they identify policy recommendations basically on a yearly basis for all the governments that they work with. So there's already a set of those recommendations in terms of what kind of policy reforms governments need to put in place for, pre-COVID situation. So that means that those governments have been working in sort of institutionalizing all those reforms, and whatever has been achieved with those reforms, it means that more money is being put into the system that's going to be benefiting those reforms. So we could in a way make that connection already. But as they move to the next stage and they update the Article 4 reports, then we have to be mindful of having the right type of policy reforms that for example, you guys in India would like to see, therefore adjust a human rights based approach and development in the country, so that it doesn't go in the wrong way, so to speak. So we have to see how that's gonna happen. And then on the World Bank, I think it's over 6 billion now in terms of disbursements in just around 100 countries. So it's compared to the amount that they want to disperse by mid next year, I would say it's low as well. It's just because it takes a lot of organizing within the World Bank. It's such a bureaucratic institution to put anything in place really and get it to the board to be approved and roll it out, and God knows what kind of discussions happen between the governments and them as well. So it's just a very, very bureaucratic institution, so they haven't gotten their act together to disperse more money sooner, but that probably is going to change as we move into the next months, so we'll have to see.
Okay, clearly an institution that should be on its way out, and old and over the hill, and let's push it off the hill.
Maybe it's just that they don't make more money available because they're doing it wrong anyway. So yeah.
Yeah. But let's try and render them irrelevant. It's very important for our struggles, and somebody who comes from the struggle background, 𝐖𝐞𝐻𝐚𝐫, has a question for you, Anuradha. He says that all the presentations were very well articulated and focused about the economic and political crisis created by IFIs. Governments of developing nations are under the iron fist of the IFIs, creating serious problems. But how do we face the challenges in protecting sovereign rights of affected people, especially marginalized sections? Any effective strategy? Anuradha, and maybe also Mehedi after Anuradha on this one. Yes.
I mean, these are some of the debates we have been having. I mean, these agendas are not new. It's just that the modus operandi keeps changing for these institutions. It's also interesting how these institutions are also finding legitimacy. Dictatorship, sort of authoritarian governments are also finding legitimacy through these institutions. In terms of strategy, I think one of the strategies which is very, very important, and I think as social movements, we have spoken about them again and again, and I think we need to really build a momentum around is some sort of a parliamentary oversight of these institutions. I mean, today we know that they are overriding our constitutional rights. The decision-making power is going in their hands. They are influencing governments. Everything is happening in an underhanded way. So that is one area, definitely. Also, it's interesting to see how they are now building state partnerships. They want to enter into state governments to put their policy influence better into local governance systems. So probably that is one area where we could probably get into, work with the local governments, agencies, try to build conversation at state levels also, and not only as a collective at a national level. And this is very important right now as they are pushing state partnerships one after the other. Yeah, these are some of the things that are coming to my mind as of now, but yeah, Mehedi bhai has something else also to add.
Even as you switch on your mic, Mehedi, just to draw your attention to another related question from Marjorie Fernandez. When governments in most poor countries are anti-people, it is not surprising that the policies of IFCs, which governments are accepting wholeheartedly, are bound to affect people adversely. Struggles need to be launched not only against the IFCs, but also against our own governments. Would you agree?
Same. I don't have anything to add with it, and it's completely that we are actually, some of the enemies or supporter of that struggle. We are not the people who are struggling on the ground. The people in the power plant areas, in the rural areas, who lost their all, including the small shop during this pandemic. They are the actual struggler. They are the actual fighter. We can help them from our own. We are living in cities, in the towns, in more in the center, so we can help them only. I'm adding with Anuradha only. Nothing more than that. Yeah, that's it.
Mehedi, you and Nezir should also quickly answer, because we've hit Cinderella time actually. It's 4:30 in India. But how do we as social movements, progressive NGOs from the South come together for a world without World Bank, which is what is primary and upmost in our minds, rather than the reform orientation of these institutions? A quick comment from Mehedi first, and then...
I already commented in that in
Yes, you
the
did. Anything more
chat
to
bar.
add?
Yeah, no, nothing,
That
nothing
we
to
should
add.
stop roasting potatoes in our fires, perhaps, as you said.
Yeah, they are roasting potatoes in in the house, in the fire where our houses are burning. So this is a tricky, and first we should start the campaign together, globally, regionally, that we need a world without this type of banks, who are saying that we need this, privatization. We need this shrinking state size. We need this, stop public service, etc., etc. So first we stop that. We should start fighting against them. Then we'll think about that. What should be the alternative. Alternative will come automatically, or there will not be a empty place. Yeah, that's all.
Nezir, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, Nezir, even
Yeah,
as,
well,
yeah.
yeah. Well, I don't think I would be an expert to give any good advice. I think I'm the one to learn probably from you guys, because you do this already and you're quite good at it. I think, in terms of getting organized and setting targets and moving the agenda, I think, there's a lot that the northern side could learn from the southern side. So, and joining forces together in a campaign like that would certainly be beneficial on both ways. And a hard one to achieve, I must say, given how the institutions play out and how the governments play out with these institutions, but certainly worth a try. And you start from the country perspective and working with the government and convincing them to do things their own way, and then build that up from there, I would say.
Okay, here we go into beyond time, but it's been very, very interesting. And Vasan, for improving emergency healthcare systems. Well, after breaking it down, like Anuradha said, the ADB has also been assisting in healthcare, but we don't see any improvements. But his question is it fair for government insurance companies like LIC of India, and tobacco companies, products which are aggravating COVID-19? I'm not so sure what that means, but Anuradha, do you want to respond? I think somebody had also said, yes, Susan Engels had said, following on Vasan's great question, just a comment, that would be vital to monitor how much of the loans for healthcare just end up directly or indirectly bailing out private healthcare providers. She's got a paper coming out with Jubilee Australia later this week, if anyone is interested. Yes, focusing on Sri Lanka and Indonesia. But on India, Anuradha, do you want to say something?
I think it's a it's important to, I mean, I know these are things that have been happening from, and these are to support healthcare systems, but that is not the point. I think the point is, what is the underlying thing of that? It is not a direct support for healthcare, improvement of healthcare and making sure it's reaching the most marginalized sections. The idea is to bring in policy changes, and I think that is the core of it. Anything that is taking away your constitutional rights from you, your pushing in privatization of public health services in country where such huge population still cannot avail health services, I think is nothing less than criminal. And I think that is why it is relevant and it's important to critique, to call out these institutions for the underhand way of bringing in these changes, which ultimately just push these worsened situations more and more.
I'll just take 1 minute because there's one thing that Atul Dhir wants us to focus on. He asked the panel, what are your views about the TA, the technical assistance provided by the World Bank, IMF or ADB, which is so-called to assist the target agenda developing a country, but the assistance eventually turns into dependencies at the end of the day and no progress, impact or future is achieved. I mean, this is, of course, many of us who've been targeting these banks and their meddlesome ways in our sovereignty and their conditionalities and their impact on communities. It could be obvious too, but if someone wants to go in a minute, and then I want to hand over to Maju. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, yes, of course. I mean, technical assistance programs, if you actually break them down, there are nothing but a way to change policy and implement the policies of the bank and intertwine them with local governance structures and damage our local governance structures rather, and nothing else, nothing more than that. Dependency, yes, they ultimately do increase the dependency, but I think more important than that is the fact that these technical assistance programs are now becoming a legitimized way to bring in policy changes, to bring in changes in the governance structures at the lowest levels. And this is what should scare us.
Absolutely. I think we have no more time for any more comments. I think Dr. Meera Shiva had asked for, okay, Mehedi, let me not shut you up. Otherwise, I'll be accused of elder brother from India shutting up Bangladesh. Come on. Yes, go.
Okay, 1 minute with, okay, I'm adding something with Anuradha. Yeah. Technical assistance is like, you know, if I want you to eat potato as a staple food, I'll give you a technical assistance first to you to make a paper whether potato is better than rice or wheat. So then, then you will start eating potato. So technical assistance in Bengali, we call it like feu before a tiger. We send a feu to Reki the field, then send a tiger to eat you.
We don't know what a feu is.
Yeah,
please
feu means gidar. Feu means gidar. Okay, you know the Hindi people, you know gidar. Gidar. This means jackal. Yeah, like jackal. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Okay. All right.
So technical assistance like this to make a Reiki whether the tiger can come or not. So then the tiger will come and bite you. That is it. Thank you.
Yes, Doctor. Thank you, Mehedi. Thank you, Nezir, and thank you, Anuradha, so much. It's been very, very informative and educative, as Dr. Meera Shiva is saying. And Meera, you will find the whole recording on the Facebook link that you have on your screen. Let's keep pushing towards a world without the World Bank. And it's never too late. We've kept them on for far too long, but let's at least now try to get them off the map. Yes, and I think Rosama earlier had talked of decentralization. Definitely, our struggles are decentralized, and Ashok Chaudhary has reminded us that there are a lot of us who are concerned and very knowledgeable about the problems that these banks and these Bretton Woods institutions have wrought upon us, but we do not know how to resolve them. There is a problem in linking us together. We shall attempt, Ashok Da, to really work better together and give a concerted push off the cliff to these institutions. Over to Maju from CFA. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for this wonderful discussion around it. We would like to request all of you to join and participate in the week of action. More information on this would be available in the working group on ifis.net website and the CFA website. So we request all of you to tweet, to write, to blog, to talk to people around on policies of World Bank, so that a mass movement could be built on the same. We would also request all of you to join us on our next webinar, which is on 15th October, which is on World Bank's role in creating smart cities and its socio-political impacts in developing countries, experiences from the South. This webinar will be addressed by Gelson Garcia, who is an independent consultant from Philippines, Elisa, who is the executive director of Rujak Center for Urban Studies, Indonesia, Professor Chris Hartley from the Department of Asian and Policy Studies, the Education University of Hong Kong, and Gaurav Dwivedi of Center for Financial Accountability. So this is also an attempt to bring people from across South Asia together in this campaign to imagine a world without world banks. Finally, a word of thanks to our translators, Mr. Suraj and Siddharth, who have been translating this discussions, much of our discussions in English, and also was going very fast. They have painstakingly translated this into Hindi, and thank you very much. So we expect everyone to join us for the webinar back on 15th October. Thank you everyone.
More importantly, we expect everyone to work with us towards a world without World Bank.